Okay, so we have David Bailey and his presentation on 5 minutes to midnight, an even bigger rush. And David, I'm going to hand over for you to have presentation right now, and I'll let you get yourself set up and then take it away.
Okay, so I'll start with the traditional start of all these meetings is, can you see my screen? But I'm assuming you can.
Yes.
Okay, so thanks for coming along to this. I did a presentation about a year ago at the physical ISTC conference called 10 to Midnight, and as the heart of information architecture is reuse of existing content, I've retooled this one to be 5 to Midnight. So this is a presentation following similar themes, but with a year update. So David Bailey, that's me. I'm an information architect at Sneak as of September, so 3 whole months in the job. I've been a technical communications professional for 26 years, and probably most of that as a technical writer. And in the past 5 or 6 years, I've transitioned to become more of an information architect, which is what I'm doing now. And as I said, I presented the 10 to midnight session last year. Now it's 5 to midnight. Hopefully next year won't be midnight. Who knows? We shall see. What we will do in this presentation is we'll look through the, I'll go through the background of my new company, Sneak. We'll talk about the problems they're having at documentation level and the solutions that we're implementing at those levels. And we'll also maybe do a bit of reflections or lessons learned as we go through. So Sneak, the company, it offers software products for secure cloud native development. I won't go into too much of the details. You can look on the Sneak website for that. But the key part of the product offering is that it's a developer first mentality. So the company sells software to developers, and its focus is always to put the developer first in the product, in the chain, in the selling process, and in the documentation. The company's got very rapid growth. It started in 2015, and I think it's now 450. It was about 400 employees last month when I wrote this. Is now about 450. We're aiming to get around about 600 by the end of next year. So it's a very fast growing company. There is a lot of content, a lot of documentation being written, and a lot of platforms that is being written on. Sneak as a company is very keen on new tools. This is a great thing, except when you get lots and lots of different tools and lots of platforms, then you have to try and make sense of it, which is where I come in. So in terms of content writing, documentation writing at Sneak, we don't have specific technical writers. We did have, they left, we're doing it a different way now. So it does have a lot of new features. Every 2 or 3 days, it usually comes up with a new feature, and that usually gets released on a continuous basis. So it's a very fast moving environment. The content, the documentation, this is blog to posts, this is product documentation, release announcements, are written by the subject matter experts, usually product managers or product developers. They usually write the content, and that gets squirted out in one of the many platforms that we use. So that's great. The guys are really good at writing content. They do it well. It's already devolved down, which is half of the battle. And you know, for what it is, it's fantastic. However, it means there are some gaps. So there's gaps in consistency. So gaps, one thing might be written to cover one set of functionality, another thing to cover a similar set of functionality, but maybe doesn't cover the same areas. Gaps in between features, feature descriptions in terms of stuff that's not necessarily owned by one feature team. So for example, getting started content wasn't owned by any particular team. And there's gaps in terms of style and standards in terms of adhering to corporate style and making sure that it looks like it's written by one particular voice. So, first of the videos.
We have to cut these things so damn close.
Oh, I love the 1980s films. I've got a couple more coming along there, but I'm sure we can all relate to the fact that everything in documentation seems to be cut right to the end of the line. It tends to get delivered and we get involved fairly late in the process. In theory, and this applies to waterfall, it applies to agile, it applies to all release development. In theory, we should have a nice, simple design, then develop, then documentation, then deploy cycle that we can go through, and we get time to do this. In practice, what happens a lot of the time is the development process gets shifted to the right, so it gets shifted later in the cycle. We in docs get squeezed. We're having to do a lot of stuff very late in the day. It might even be we get squeezed from both ends because the deployment, say we need more time to test and deploy it, in which case we have to write documentation at the wrong end of the process, to the right-hand side of the process, and we have to write it quickly, and we maybe not have the access to the information we need to at that point. So that has impacts on quality and impacts on release, and it kind of like feels you're twiddling your thumbs at the start of the process because you've got to do a rush job at the end. This shouldn't be particularly new. So one solution, and people have thought about this, one solution is, can't we just be agile? Why not? Okay, we've got 10 development teams, 10 agile development teams. We would normally expect to put documentation, maybe put a writer in each of those development teams. So yes, you could do that, and yes, technically it probably would work, but that's a big scaling up. So you've got 10 development teams, that's 10 new writers. That means that you've got a lot. I mean, if you can afford it, great. Most companies don't want to put that much investment in technical writing, but also that takes away the ownership. Takes away the ownership from the subject matter experts. They kind of feel they want to throw it over the fence, then maybe work on it later or let somebody else do it. It's not my job anymore, so I don't have ownership. So I think that is to the detriment of the quality of the information. I think we want to have ownership with the subject matter experts. Kind of another alternative that you could do is to spread out writers in between teams. So I worked for a company a while back, and they had, say, again, 10 Scrum teams, and writers would usually cover 2 to 3 teams. So you'd have maybe only 4 writers over the 10 teams. So the problem with that is that Scrum, Agile does require a lot of meetings, so you can actually have a lot of communication. So you could easily spend, a writer could easily spend half of their productive time simply going to meetings for these Scrum teams, because you've got 3 sets of stand-ups a day, you've got retrospectives, you've got planning, grooming sessions, you've got all of that, but multiplied by 3 because you're on 3 teams. So it means you only have maybe half of your time to spread out over documentation for those 3 teams. So it's not, doesn't scale well, it's not particularly efficient, and you might have to make difficult choices about which meetings to attend if you're involved in an agile team, which of course as a writer brings you away from that particular content. So you're not as involved or not as aware as much as you would be otherwise. So it doesn't scale well, so it's less productivity. And finally, Scrum methodology is not really clear. It's not very obvious what Scrum should be like for writers. It doesn't explicitly say things. And I've asked many times about this, and you usually get a shrug. Who knows? Give it a go. Yeah, so it's not very good. So I think we need a different process rather than just be agile. So one thing that's always, another more recent film.
You never worry. Would it help?
I think we can all relate to that. General rule in life, don't worry. What we're implementing at Sneak is effectively what we're calling continuous integration, continuous delivery for documentation. So CICD, continuous integration, continuous delivery, in summary means you do, instead of one big job at the end of a release to integrate and deliver code, it gets done on a daily or frequent basis so that you don't have to worry about it at the end of the release cycle. You can just get this done ideally with automation tools during the release process, during the development process. So another way of putting this is for documentation is that we're both shifting left and shifting down. And I'll go into that in the next slide. But the reason we're calling it CICD, it actually matches documentation processes, but it also matches our company business culture. This is our selling point. This is what we as a company are very familiar with as a process. So this is a good way of getting it as a hook from one particular company. Okay, so shifting left, shifting down. Productivity, shifting left. This is in terms of getting more content earlier, more accessible to more people, so increasing the knowledge sharing and allow more editorial review during that process. Second part of this is shifting down, and we've largely achieved this already at Sneak, which is by spreading the content to the SMEs, to actually allow the SMEs to create the content. This gives them more ownership of that content, as I talked about earlier. And it also means that the documentation work and the documentation function has more high profile because they're involved in it personally. It allows them to be involved in it, and it generally gives them a more a closer relationship with documentation. Okay, so referring back to the old diagram I did before, we had squeezed documentation, squeezed in between development and deployment. This way, the new practice, we are shifting documentation left earlier on, and we're shifting it down into the underneath, into the continuous process, or continuous process, continuous integration, continuous delivery. So the idea of this is documentation gets involved at the start, it keeps on going incrementally throughout the development process, and we get it done earlier, but it also gets done by different people rather than specific technical writers. Okay, how I'm involved, how the information architecture function is involved, is to make this work, to make the process work, to provide management of the process, to actually create the process, to ensure that documentation information goes for review and goes for editorial. So whenever there's new content being created, I'm the editorial resource they come to give feedback on that. And also, well, I am creating content myself, so I am writing still. But at creating content, generally speaking, as good examples of good practice, trailblazer examples I put there, so that we can ensure people have an example of a template to follow. And of course, helping people to do this. So supporting them with editorial, with ideas, with feedback, training them, giving writing training for them so they can understand how to create this content, providing resources and documentation to support this, so style guides, that kind of thing, and of course promoting this as a feature, as a project to ensure that people know what they should be doing. It works, yay, great. So content is created, it's being done, we are still creating content, it is consistent and it is delivered at the time of the release, and it is owned by the subject matter experts. I am now rolling out writing training to ensure that they do it better and they do it more consistently. We are also embedding documentation review as part of the feature design process rather than the entire feature deployment or development process. So that's all happening, that's all working, and that's coming along really well. So far, so good. Again, I've only been here 3 months, but they were halfway there already, so it's much easier to get that moving from that point of view. So it's working. Some things to maybe think about, some reflections or summaries. So anytime you want to do a return on investment, you do need the investment. There is no cunning way of avoiding this. You need to invest in the people. So you need to have people like myself managing the process. You need to invest in the training, again, training them to write, training them to think about consistency and standards. And you need to invest in the tools, a tool that is good enough in terms of power to manage it, but it's also not too intimidating to get to use. If someone's only going to be accessing it once or twice a month, you wouldn't want to give them a full-on course in Madcap Flare, because that would take a lot of time to get people up to speed with that. Organization culture also matters, and if you're in an organization which is embracing change and is happy to change and always looks to change and improve, it's much easier to sell this sort of thing. If you're in an organization which is a bit more difficult or a bit more set in its ways, or has more invested in a particular way of doing things, then obviously change is more difficult. You know, change is always difficult. I think I'll talk about that in a second. And moving from being technical writers to information architects, you need new skills. So you need to become documentation champions, even more so than you would as a tech writer. You need to become a trainer. You need to tell people how to do the stuff that you do, and you need to get them to do it to a point themselves. And of course, you need to be a project manager. You know, if I go back to the example, 10 different teams doing 10 different sets of features all of the time, you need to keep track on what's doing, what features are coming out, what's being done. But it does mean that you can smooth your involvement over the course of the process rather than being involved right at the end of the process. Okay, so last one, hopefully.
I say good business is where you find it.
I had to shoehorn the RoboCop quote in because it's just great quote. So this is the way I'm implementing it, but the way I'm implementing it at Sneak is different from the way I would have implemented it at other companies. So you have to learn from what subject matter experts are doing, their practices, tweak and adapt what they do, remove, even though you might like it, remove what doesn't work or what doesn't fit in with their culture. So you've got to always be continuously learning from what other people are doing. And that's a general point, of course, but especially for this type of cultural change. And again, focusing on change. Anytime you need to make this sort of change, it's going to be a challenge. People hate change, but it's much easier if you can get management buy-in. And again, a lot of that will depend on the company culture, but don't try and get forgiveness rather than permission. Do try and get permission first, because you're going to be affecting how a lot of people work. So it's definitely a good idea to let them know in advance. And you need to sell it, you need to promote it, you need to communicate it, you need to make sure that people involved understand the benefits of moving to a new system. Everyone hates change, it can be challenging. Making the process as easy as possible. I'm much more of a carrot than a stick kind of guy. So make the process and the technology they're using as easy as possible. Again, emphasizing that a full-on content management system with very powerful technical writing features may not be appropriate at an interface level for someone who only uses it, say, twice a month. So you've got to find the sweet spot to allow people easy access to creating content. And again, emphasizing you've got to deliver training, you've got to deliver documentation to support this process. And it turns out you probably will then turn into a support function rather than necessarily a writing function. And that's good. That's what you want to do. So another tweak, another tip might be to two actually here. One is for induction or onboarding sessions. If you're hiring new people, give them onboarding about content creation and training about content creation as soon as they join, before they have any preconceived ideas. That gets them early. It's a kind of Jesuit approach. Gets them when they're 7, gets them when they're just starting, helps mold that. And if you can, get as part of people's job description, you're going to be writing some content in as many people's job descriptions as possible, so that they understand that's part of their role from the start. May or may not be possible, but it's worth the try. Oops. So, any questions? I have finally managed to work my chat window, so any questions, very happy to have them now.
I was just a very good presentation. Thanks. Yeah, I enjoyed it. But I was just thinking, I mean, at one level, it's sort of really inspiring that we can learn and need to learn all these new skills and apply them. And at another level, that's also quite daunting. But then also sharing a lot of what we think of as our role, writing content, with colleagues who are not technical communicators. Do you have any concerns about sort of diluting what you are and people sort of losing track of, you know, why you need to be there at all?
Yeah, am I doing myself out of a job?
Well,
yeah. I would say change for us is also a little bit scary, you know, and you know, there's still technical writer jobs and there will still always be technical writer jobs. For me, I've found that this is far more rewarding than simply being a writer, and it's far more empowering. And it turns out that people value you, weirdly enough, value you more as being an editor, a reviewer, a font of all knowledge about the process, rather than necessarily a content expert. So I can only talk to my experience in this one, but it feels like because we are much more in their business, we are much more in their face in terms of being involved in their process and getting them to do work which we're asking them to do, they value us more. So I think, I know what you're saying, and I had those concerns. Oh no, if everyone's a writer, what am I doing? Well, what we're doing is we're helping them be better writers, and it's not like they're ever going to spend years becoming technical writers. We're just getting them kind of to the point where they don't do stupid stuff. You know, and that means that our editorial involvement becomes easier. They get to be better writers, but there's always change in any company, and there's always churn. So we'll always have. I found that I've always had a role, and that's always worked as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We've got a couple on the chat. So Mike says, have you tried to embed the style guide into the development process? Not yet, but that's an interesting idea. I think, yeah, no, but not yet, but I will steal that, reuse that, and use it. I think our style guide we did have a style guide. It was kind of hidden away and didn't have much love, and I've been working on it in our intranet system off and on for the past couple of months. It's not quite ready for automation, but I do like the idea of maybe putting it in. I'll see if we can do that. I think it may be more trouble than it's worth, but we'll have a look at it. That's a good idea. I like it. No, pushbacks from developers, not at Sneak, because they were kind of doing the work anyway. They were kind of creating the work anyway. I'm helping to make their job easier and better, and they're also quite forward thinking about this one. At my previous company, certainly implementing this was a little bit more of a push, and we had to have a few preliminary discussions at various different levels before we could implement it. So it's now fair to say it is, as a process, embedded, but I'd also expand upon that by saying some companies, not all, but some companies, there are, shall we say, about 10% of people who are just going to not do it. They're going to resist this, they're going to push back, they're just going to find any old reason not to do a change, and that's just their personality. And part of promotion and sales and communication is to find a way of working around that. So say you've got an average company might have 10% enthusiastic adopters or first adopters, 10% I will never change, it's good enough for my grandfather, it's good enough for me kind of things, and maybe 80% in the middle. And your job is to basically make sure there's enough enthusiasm from the first adopters. They'll be our docs champions, and then they can start, that will start filtering down. If it turns out that 90% of people are doing this, then funnily enough, everyone else feels the peer pressure, and then you can start squeezing in the ones who are, I mean, being blunt, irrational about it and just don't want to change to anything. And then you can work around that. So it's not a perfect process, and you will get some pushback depending on how you sell it. But that's why making the sale is the important part of the process. But good question.
There's some questions just above those. A couple of people asked, which or what tools are you using?
Oh gosh. So Sneak has I would not exaggerate to say it has about 14 different documentation platforms. At the moment, the main product documentation is embedded within the support site, which is based on a solution called Zendesk, which is a help desk solution. It's not ideal because it doesn't allow much in editing. So what we generally do is we write content in Google Docs, do the review and editing on that, and then we have the horribly painful process of porting from Google Docs into Zendesk format, cleaning up the markup and so on. It's not ideal. We also have content user guides written in more developer-friendly formats. So there's API documentation in a tool called Apiary. There is, and that will probably move to something called Open API Swagger. There is GitHub documentation. So that's in the actual GitHub repositories themselves. So there's READMEs in there. And there's information which is done as part of a blog for a feature release, which is controlled by the website. So that's usually, I think that's powered by WordPress. We also have release notes, which are release announcements put in the application. That's a tool called, there's a tool called Intercom, which allows chat. And then there's a tool called Headway, which allows release notes. One of the things I haven't really touched on in this is trying to get rid of so many different tools. So one of my jobs will be not adding on many, many different platforms. So primarily the documentation is published in Zendesk.
And I had one of my own questions, which was just, you talked about you're more of a carrot than a stick kind of guy. And I was curious, like, what did you how did you go about selling that change then? Were there any sort of lessons learned around the actual promotion of this idea to all the different stakeholders involved?
So confidence is the key. is if you say, if you promote a clear, concise, consistent vision of where you want to get to and sell that, it's the elevator pitch. So it is, you do turn into a bit of a salesperson. It's the elevator pitch to management to say, we're going to do this because it will be better, it will be quicker, it will take less people's time, and we'll get better results out of it. That's the top level management pitch. Then if they're, obviously, depending on how low you go, you then go into more details about what you need to do. But I think culture change is the whole, you could do an entire session on culture change and getting people to do different things. Getting ourselves to do different things it's difficult. I've learned in the past 3 months, I think the first 2 or 3 weeks, I learned a new tool every day. You know, it's a lot of learning, a lot of adaptation, and a lot of cognitive dissonance and going to bed with headaches and things like that, but because we don't like change. So you have to sell the change to people as being something that's going to be good for them, for their job, and also good for the company. A lot of the time, it's much easier to sell the change if people are willing to adapt, but also at a certain pain point. So they're seeing, it's obvious to, say, management, the pain of, say, delay in documentation is coming back, and you're getting customer feedback saying the documentation was rubbish, it came out 2 weeks after the release, I've learnt it all by then, it's useless. That is something you can use to sell. If you're in that type of unfortunate situation, you can say this will solve that particular problem. But a lot of the time when you're implementing a new solution, I like to say this is the problem. We're not just doing this for the sake of it, we're doing it to solve an actual clear business problem. Depending on how much of a sales job you need to make, you may want to put some metrics around that. You know, 50% of incidents that we receive in our help desk are because of poor information or something like that.
There's been an interesting comment in chat as well, just about people's reasons perhaps for being reluctant to start doing content creation, and in particular, for example, a developer who might have English as a second language. I'd be interested just sort of like if that sparks any thoughts for you about how you might respond in that situation. So
yes, firstly, I do have a writing training sessions, and that part of that is plain English. It's about writing clearly, and it's about managing expectations. And no one expects developers to be wonderful writers. Goodness knows it's difficult sometimes to get writers to be wonderful writers. But what I try and say there is try and keep it as simple as possible and try and keep it plain. And here's some tips. Here's things to do. Here's things not to do. And I've also got things in terms of, this is both for English as an additional language readers and writers, and also for English as native language readers and writers, and things that you may have as cultural assumptions. The classic example is using e.g. instead of for example, and I tend to knock that on the head. There's also, so basically it is a good point, but if you've got a lot of your company like ours that are not English native speakers, it actually makes it easier because they understand the pain of these kind of things.
Interesting, thank you. Okay, so at this point, David, thank you very much for your presentation. I will go ahead and stop the recording now.